Hi, my name is Daniela Muggia and I am an Italian thanatologist. My field of study is therefore dying, death and grief. In over 30 years of study of the Tibetan thanatology and about 24 years of caring for persons at the end of their life, as well as for their families and the personnel attending to them, I developed a method called ESEL, the empathic care of the end of life. ESEL is based both on the traditional practices that are coming from the Tibetan studies on death and dying, and the most recent Western discoveries in neuroscience, neurocardiology, and quantum physics. The Tibetan observed how we become more and more empathic at the end of our life. How does it happen, and what does this entail in terms of understanding what consciousness is? Tibetan call elements what we can perhaps qualify as subatomic energy. It could be considered as a first, let's say, qualitative differentiation of the infinite energy that lays as a still undifferentiated potential within the quantum field. All phenomena collapsing from the field potential might therefore be seen according to the element description, as a mix of all the elements with the prevalence of one or another, which makes phenomena all different and continuously changing. Our mind or consciousness is as well considered as a phenomenon. Tibetan dedicated centuries to explore the mind or consciousness, so that the Tibetan Buddhist philosophy is first of all a science of mind. They arrived at the conclusion that both the outer reality and the mind have two aspects, one relative and one, let's say, absolute, not differently from what the quantum physics states, describing, for instance, the reality as both particle and field, depending on the observer. What the Tibetan call the absolute aspect of consciousness, the so-called true nature of the mind, this is the way they call it, seems to refer directly to the quantum field, being described as empty, meaning empty of independent existence, cognitive, and the quantum field is often called information field by the Western scientists nowadays, and that from which everything proceeds, another feature of the quantum field. The relative aspect of mind, meaning our everyday state of consciousness, is described as heavily conditioned by the inputs we receive by our limited senses and other ingredients floating in the mind, like disturbing emotions, beliefs, and convictions that make us perceiving ourselves and other things as entities which are separated from the rest of the phenomena. Going back to the terms of the quantum physics, it is as saying that we erroneously perceive ourselves as just particles, and we completely miss the sense of being one with everything else, or being a part of all. The elements are in a sense the support of such a relative vision of the world during life. A support is what allows the consciousness to manifest and to interact with the relative world that is itself a mass of phenomena, and all of them are composed of these very elements. If there were no elements as a common basis between the mind who perceives and what is perceived, perception would not be possible. Now, going back to the dying, Tibetan noticed that when life comes to an end, these so-called elements are progressively reabsorbed, each one into the next, going from the most dense, called earth, to the subtlest. Like a runner that is progressively withdrawn under your feet, once the earth element starts to falter, our consciousness finds itself deprived of some of the main and grosser perception it is used to, being our senses linked, each one, with one of the elements, as described by the Tibetan medicine. For instance, once the element earth starts to flicker, our side also does. In this process, our perceptions progressively change, one after the other. Once the earth element ceases to be the main support of the consciousness, the next subtler element, called water, becomes the main support of consciousness. Water element starts pervading our perceptions and even our physical manifestations, and so on. The physical signs of what is called the element dissolution are easily recognized, but to catch the inner change of perception, once the normal communication is interrupted by the proximity of death, you need to cultivate a stable capacity of attention. That is what basic meditation provides as its first fruit. Here is not the right environment to explore how more compassionate and adaptive is the care for dying, that knows where they are with their perceptions, therefore taking this into account when communicating with them. But what we can observe in terms of consciousness is that for a dying person, the more the gross and limiting inputs from our usual senses are reduced via the reabsorbing of the element, the best the perception of the true nature seems to be. They seem to have an incredible chance to catch the true nature of both mind and things. And this is why death is considered a very special time by the Tibetan and Eastern cultures in general. This is where you have a chance to see how things are without the usual bias of obscuration I briefly described. And this clarity and the capacity to remain in it is what is called enlightenment. Many traditional cultures describe in some way the shift of perception happening when we are dying and in the moment of death. Often the vision one has at the end of life are astounding, difficult to be expressed in words. We call them pre-death visions. Those who are not familiar with their peculiar aspect can easily misperceive them and take them for hallucinations. They impute such visions to the effect of medical palliative treatments commonly prescribed at the end of life. What an error! These visions or shifts in perceptions are an important resource to the dying we can use for accruing their resilience in such a difficult situation. We should therefore not discard them all as mere side effects of treatment. We should remember instead that in quantum mechanics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle states that we evaluate reality according to our perceptive capacity, which are quite limited. Therefore, we do not possess an exhaustive perception of reality. Things you don't see, it doesn't mean they do not exist. How can we recognize the pre-death vision from hallucination, for instance? It requires some training on our side. I will try to explain how it works in a while. As I said already, the pre-death visions are a very common event. It seems the dying persons all share a different range of perceptions in the same manner as we share among ourselves a common range of perception we like to call objective reality. A leaf is a leaf. We all usually agree on this point. It is green, etc. But we know by now that these are just relative perceptions of reality and not the absolute reality itself, of course. All depend on the observer. Curiously enough, the Buddhist culture pointed it out since its beginning. The ancient texts even explore many different kinds of consciousness, not only the human type of consciousness. They remind us that water is something to drink or to fear for us, but it's perceived as home by a fish, and so on. Now, going back to the dying again, and to our ways of caring for them, let's talk of the training that allows us to become aware at least of their set of perceptions. And what is this useful for? Paul Ekman, considered as one of the world's greatest experts on emotions, explains that the very practice of learning to focus attention on an automatic process that requires no conscious monitoring creates the capacity to be attentive to other automatic processes we are usually not aware of. We breathe without thinking, without conscious direction of each inhalation or exhalation. Nature does not require that we divert our attention to breathing. When we try paying attention to each breath, people find it very hard to do for more than, let's say, 1 minute, without being distracted by thoughts, of course. Learning to focus our attention on breathing takes daily practice, in which we develop new neural pathways that allow us to do it. And here is the punchline. These skills transfer to other automatic processes, benefiting emotional behavior awareness and eventually, in some people, impulse awareness. This attentiveness, cultivated through a basic form of meditation called Shine in Tibetan and Shamatha in Sanskrit, makes us aware of information we are all the time immersed in and not aware of. We become more empathetic. The way a dying person perceives things becomes therefore more accessible to us, and this is why I call this approach to death and dying empathic care of the end of life. Nevertheless, an attentiveness so refined to become an empathic listening is not enough. The ancient Tibetan tradition and Western science both agree on this point. The empathic listening has to be ethically oriented towards compassion. Why? The most recent discoveries of Tanya Zinger confirm that the area of the brain that is activated in states of empathy is not the same as that which becomes active when you feel compassion, that is, when you wish that someone were free from suffering. Empathy alone, namely an extended awareness to the other person's state, is dangerous. The area of empathy is developed even in the brains of psychopaths. A torturer, for example, must know exactly how much his victims are suffering in order to inflict more suffering on them. On the other hand, what is not developed in the psychopath is the area of compassion. Compassion is very different from pity, which maintains a distance between the one that feels strong and the other perceived as weak. It is rather the healthy desire to relieve the suffering of the other while taking care of ourselves at the same time. The 14th Dalai Lama often defines compassion as the inability to tolerate another's suffering. And Sogyal Rinpoche describes it in these terms: compassion is a far greater and nobler thing than pity. Pity has root in fear and a sense of arrogance and condescension, sometimes even a smug feeling of "I am glad it's not me." To train in compassion, then, is to know all beings are the same and suffer in similar ways, to honor all those who suffer, and to know you are neither separate from nor superior to anyone. And this was a quote of Sogyal Rinpoche's book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. Therefore, we need a training in attentiveness and in compassion to build up or enhance the neuron pathways, allowing us to open up our mind to the same set of perception a dying person has, and also to become ourselves peace, so that they can perceive this state immediately, a very quick way to help them dine in peace. Once the new neuron pathways are steadily activated, the carer and the dying come to know each other by feeling what the other feels. They do not melt, they remain distinct. Distinct, yes, but not distant. Having access to all this information, we are, as we said, always immersed in, but usually not aware of, suggests that there is a reality full of information we can tap into as soon as our mind is a little more trained. And where are these information stored? Scientists are starting to call the quantum field, as I said, an information field. Erwin Laszlo calls it the Akashic field, referring to an Oriental term that might well describe this cognizant quality of the quantum field. Couldn't non-locality be considered as a cognitive phenomenon within the quantum field, which is informing itself in zero time? This brings us to another very important point on which scientists are divided, and that concerns consciousness. Is our consciousness a byproduct of the brain activity, therefore confined to the brain and finishing with the death of our brain? Or do these and other experiences suggest that it is not confined to the brain? Ring and Cooper described 21 cases of NDE, the near-death experiences, of those having been born blind. Their NDE are identical to those of people having no sight problem. The blind reported having seen their bodies lying on the bed, the hospital personnel at work, and they report plenty of details that are absolutely corresponding to the reality. Then, of course, they report the tunnel and the light at the end and other experience, as well as meeting with their beloved parents and other beings having passed away already. Now, these persons did not have any figurative or visual dream before their near-death experience. Some of them reported even the phenomenon of seeing at 360 degrees, the same we find from time to time in the NDE of the normal sighted. Now, it's difficult to escape to the conclusion that consciousness transcends the brain, as we are facing a complete absence of functioning sight apparatus before and after the NDE in these persons. While the scientists apply their minds to solve this problem, the Tibetan thanatology reveals to be an appropriate guide in communication with the dying. A trained carer can really maintain communication even when there are apparently no more normal ways to communicate. What if we could apply this to those being in coma? The West calls death the state when the heartbeat ceases and the encephalograph produces a flat line, a state the Tibetan medicine still calls life, as another and more subtle dissolution is going to take place in the consciousness itself. Could an observer ascertain this by the means of a cultivated, enlarged perceptive state, as the one I briefly described before? And if consciousness is still present for a while after the so-called death, what would this entail when organs are removed for transplantation? All this opens up a huge field of study and search, and I'm more than happy to participate. You see hereafter where you can contact me wherever you are. Thank you. Have a nice day.